Hi there, I'm Tim Lindsay.
And I'm Christian Bonner.
This is Under the Radar, a Rolling Stones podcast about deep cuts and hot cookies.
And let me tell you, this is not your father's Rolling Stones podcast.
We're here to serve up opinions you're not going to hear on any other format or medium because we're the only people in the world who think like this.
Yes, we have consulted with top Rolling Stones clergymen,
Gurus,
economists,
shamans,
people from all walks of life, really. And they've all said to us, we really want to hear your idiosyncratic
pontification
and highly partisan opinions about the Rolling Stones. So we're starting, because it is the 20th anniversary of really what could easily be the flagship for this whole story here.
It's the landmark album of the 90s, really.
For me it was, but I had a pretty weird 90s. But we're talking about Bridges to Babylon.
We all had a weird 90s.
Yeah, there's a lot I don't remember. We'll
go into like the context of this album, but we should say today the focus is on the amazing 1997 Rolling Stones release, Bridges to Babylon.
Yes, and so this is right around the time, 97, 98 is right around the time that I got into the Stones. And I have to admit that I was a Beatles fan for a while.
Well, the Beatles were kind of inescapable the years before that, right? They had a big renaissance with the anthology TV show.
I didn't think about that, but that's true. And, this was for the reason, and this is all important, my personal journey here is important because when everyone else was getting into grunge, I was getting into the Beatles.
Right.
And then everyone thought, well, this guy's really weird. And now it's kind of accepted that there are classic rock people in high schools, but I was one of the first. You're
gonna plant your flag there.
I invented this, okay? I just want everyone to know.
So when we're talking about, growing up, we should mention that we're 80s kids.
Yeah, I'm 84.
I'm an 86 baby.
Yeah.
So what happened was, when we were kids, you had the grunge revolution. We're both Canadian, so it wasn't MTV, but it was Much Music, which is like your kind of main diet of video and music information on the Rolling Stones or on any other band that you cared to get into. You
watched it. I remember watching the music video channels, even though I didn't like them.
Sure. There's a lot of garbage on there.
Oh yeah, and a lot of people will also famously remember, if they knew me at that time, that I was very opposed to the pop music and hip hop of the 90s, but I have really flip-flopped on that hard. I listened to 2001 pretty much every day.
Yeah, Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg,
Mariah, all of them, like all the 90s people I listen to. No, I do, because I think the production is fantastic, and I realized, this is a great thing to talk about because I really like the way production. A lot of people talk about 90s production, and we should also mention that we're both audio people, but like a lot of people idolize 90s production, but when they say that, they're talking about Steve Albini,
sure,
and the way he produced Nirvana.
Yeah, the live off the floor kind of thing.
That's all fine.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm talking about. I want to talk about Dr. Dre. I want to talk about Ocean Way Studios. I want to talk about, session guys making the AAA pop music, because
that's basically what this album is.
That is totally what it is, because Ocean Way is where Bridges to Babylon was made.
Yeah, it's a big Los Angeles studio with several different live rooms.
If you look up Ocean Way Studios, I guarantee you many of your favorite records were done there. Yep. All the Disney scores were done there. Yep. Anything orchestral, all the Nelson Riddle, Sinatra stuff.
A lot of the Beck records that are actually good were all made there.
Yeah, so that the Beck record, the reason why, one of the technical reasons that people will find interesting here, one of the reasons why, if you think about the records like Odelay or Bridges to Babylon or 2001, the thing that they all have in common is organic musical elements made on real instruments.
Live drums,
live vocals with synthesizers. And the reason...
And loops.
Yeah,
Pro Tools is in there in the mix, and samplers.
Yeah, and the reason all this stuff was able to blend together, I believe, is very much thanks to the Focusrite Forte console that they have there. Because
right. So we should explain for non-technical people, when we're talking about the console, that's the big mixing desk that you see everybody with their hands on. So the elements that go into the song, all the different separate tracks of the recording, have to go through the console in order to be mixed together.
Yes.
So it's kind of the glue that's helps everything sit.
And so the
together.
ISA 110 preamps that are in the Focusrite Forte console, they are just colored enough to be interesting, and but they're clean enough that they can blend.
So when you've got somebody like Charlie Watts, who is a very traditional drummer. Like he plays the same way he's always played. He's got a style that's very much influenced by swing and jazz drummers.
Engineers hate him.
Yeah. So this one weird trick to mic up a drum kit.
Yeah, and he's very dynamic, and the point is the reason why engineers don't like him is because he's very dynamic, and he'll hit the kick drum harder, for instance, in the chorus. He hits the snare very light. He uses flat rides, which kind of they kind of wash into everything.
Yeah. So it's hard to get a good drum tone that sits with other instruments when that's his sort of style.
And Bridges to Babylon has this wonderful airy quality to it. It is just so it's like it's transparent and it's got this clarity and everything, but there's no sacrifice of the low end. There's because sometimes that's kind of the way it goes. You can't get everything. I always used to, when I was getting my records mixed, I always used to say, well, why can't I have low end like hip hop and high end like rock? Well, because there's only so much bandwidth you can use.
But somehow on this record, there's a really interesting dynamic interplay, particularly between the bass guitarists, whom there are many.
There are many. It is a tour de force of bass playing.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go in depth, track by track. But we should talk a little bit about how the Stones' career was at this point.
Right. Okay. So there's a lot of talk about, they did it in separate studios. And
it was Mick and Keith's solo album and all that.
Yeah, because there was all this talk about how much they were fighting. And there was fighting, but that came on the tour.
Yeah. I think that any differences they had in the studio were purely over creative matters rather than over personal differences.
And simple amount of work, right? They had two of them going. The fights definitely did happen towards the end when it came into like Keith trying to nullify anybody seen my baby by saying it was copped and stuff like that.
And I think Keith sort of walked out towards the end of the mixing process.
No, Mick is the one who walked out.
Oh, really?
Mick is the one who walked out because it was. If you look at the credits, there's a lot of Waddy Wachtel, there's a lot of Blondie Chaplin, there's a lot of Keith's people, and Keith was basically the one who kept digging in his heels about everything. And saying like, no, I don't want this new style production. The story about talking to Babyface and saying your face is going to look like mine when you're done with this and all this stuff. Like, so he clearly was. But that's Keith, right?
Right.
I no longer really romanticize that kind of behavior of him, and I actually think that it's very disappointing because we would have had like, if you think about how much of the 70s was lost to heroin and crummy behavior.
Well, by the time the 90s roll around, the Stones had already done several significant tours that sort of reintroduced the band after a long hiatus.
Yeah, okay, so we're talking, to contextualize this, the band nearly broke up in the mid-80s, and then they kind of reformed with Steel Wheels, and that's really because Ronnie Wood kind of brokered a piece there.
Yeah, so when Jagger and Richards get back together and start writing songs together again, they're off to the races. There's a big world tour for Steel Wheels. Then Bill Wyman leaves after that's over. And then they get a new bass player in.
Gerald Jones.
Yeah.
Who, and when people say, oh, it's the Stones and all these other people, it's like, I want to say that I am as excited when I go to see the Stones. I am as excited to see Chuck Leavell, to see Daryl Jones, to see Lisa Fisher, to see Tim Rees. And now it was Bobby, but now it's Carl Denson. These are some of the best musicians who have ever walked the face of the planet. I recently spoke to somebody on Twitter who was saying, oh, Gimme Shelter's the best Stones song. He's saying, oh, Gimme Shelter's the best Stones song, but it's all Mary Clayton. And I said to him, like Lisa Fisher has really owned that part.
Yeah. Since they've been touring with her as the kind of lead female vocalist, or only female vocalist since, I guess, Voodoo Lounge in 94. She's been the one. And now they've got Sasha Allen as a sort of fill-in. But, Lisa Fisher is the backup vocalist along with Bernard Fowler in the Stones now. So people are always saying, like, oh, it's the Vegas years. They have these, like, big groups behind them. It's really actually not that big of a group unless they've got the full horn section out with them, which they did for Steel Wheels. And they dropped it for Voodoo Lounge and then brought it back for this album. So I think on Voodoo Lounge there's a horn section, but
there's a horn. There's a. It's certainly not as small as it was on the 2012 Licks.
Right, they went down to just 2 for the 50th anniversary.
The 90s still had, like, when you look back and they still have this huge 4-piece horn section. Okay, but fine. How are you going to reproduce? When you look back at the 70s, it's like I don't think they did Tumbling Dice anywhere near the way that song needs to be performed until
With the full arrangement.
until Chuck Leavell.
Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, you couldn't hear. Like, if you go back and look, okay, Ladies and Gentlemen has like a vibe and whatever, but it's like, it's very slow, it's out of tune, it doesn't have the scale and the grandeur. That needs to come off like effortless. It can't sound labored.
So what the big band really does for the Stones is allows them to dig into those arrangements and open them up for a big stage for the audience. So when you go see the Stones and they do have that big horn section with them, the effect of it is to sort of broaden the sweep, make it more widescreen, so that, you know, when they're doing those big long vamps, like at the end of Tumbling Dice or in Jumpin' Jad Flash at the end of the show, you have the horn section there just to keep ratcheting up the tension and take it up a notch.
Well, and it's and that's absolutely true. But I also think there's elements of it that they have this huge amount of recorded material, and when people say, I want them to go back and do something stripped down, well, Exile on Main Street has some of the biggest arrangements in their catalog. I think I would have to guess that the very biggest one they ever did is You Can't Always Get What You Want.
Sure.
I don't think that they've ever had more people play on one track than that one. And so that's a very strange comment to me, because Exile on Main Street, contrary to popular belief, we were going to talk about Exile on Main Street anyway, because I think Babylon is actually probably the closest thing they've ever done. My feeling about Exile on Main Street is that it sounds like 1972.
Yeah.
And when you look at, the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour, everybody had these big bands, and the Stones were looking at people like Little Richard or Elvis's band. Compared to Elvis's review, it's nothing.
Yeah, it's really tiny, actually.
It's not even half what's on Elvis's choir in the Stones.
And even Bob Dylan at the end of the 70s was following that model.
Yeah, the Rolling Blunder review, as Tom Waits called it.
So you've got the contemporaries of the Stones who kind of get a pass for all this stuff. And then the Stones, when they try and do a kind of neoclassical approach to it, they get slagged for being, a Vegas review.
And this is the dichotomy, right? Okay, so the reason why this is important information is because on Bridges to Babylon, you have these very, very big arrangements, and it's kind of murky and dark. And there's when I have pushed people as to what they don't like about the record, aside from some very tedious comment about not liking Anybody Seen My Baby,
right?
When you really boil it down, it's about the use of synthesizers. And that's a very, very strange comment to me, because there are endless apologists for their Satanic Majesty's request.
Yeah, and the Mellotron,
is a synthesizer.
Essentially, yeah, it's a sampler.
Yeah, it's a very
tape-based sampling device.
Yeah, you're going to split hairs here?
No, like dollars to donuts. The Beatles used it.
Zeppelin, everyone used it.
King Crimson, all these bands that everybody loses their minds over. Basically, we're using a sampling device, and all but it's essentially the same approach to putting something down on a digital keyboard, only it has a tape loop.
Even more interesting, like the Mellotron. Yeah, if you don't know about the Mellotron, go read about it.
Yeah,
it's super cool. But even more interestingly, the first synthesizer that ever made its way to England was collectively bought by the Rolling Stones. They sold it when they realized, this is really complicated. I think they sold it to Floyd or somebody in King Crimson or something like that. But anyway, the point about this is everyone was experimenting with synthesizers towards the late end of the 60s. There are synthesizers on Jumping Jack Flash. There's a Mini Moog, I believe.
I don't know, but...
No. I don't know anything about synthesizers. I shouldn't start talking about it.
But the point is that...
There are synths on these records, on these timeless classic records, and no one bats an eye.
Yeah.
Yet people freak out about it happening in the 90s. Why is that? Here's my theory. In the late 60s and early 70s, rock was still... the second generation rock was still new enough, and that it meant we're experimenting, we're trying new things.
Sure.
But post-punk... Now, remember, punk was a response to prog more than it was a response to the Rolling Stones. If anything, Malcolm McLaren hijacked the Rolling Stones model and just did it in an even more hyperbolic way. Those guys apparently they used to line up to the Sex Pistols used to line up to kiss Keith Richards' ring.
Well, if anybody has a spiritual successor in the rock and roll world, Keith Richards is fathered many sons in that respect.
Totally.
So what you're looking at is the kind of post-punk fallout after Nirvana falls apart with the death of Kurt Cobain in the mid-90s. And there's a very polarized atmosphere.
At that point, rock means we have guitars, there's no keyboards, there's a bass, and there's drums, and that's it.
Yeah.
And to me, that is bizarre. Rock and roll was fueled by pianos. Johnny Johnson's keyboard parts on Chuck Berry records are...
Yep. Cherry Lee Lewis.
I may have heard of him.
Yep.
Little Richard, Fats Domino. So many early rock and roll people were playing...
essentially boogie woogie licks.
Yeah, totally. And and they had upright bass, and they had a more diverse approach to... you go to Zydeco, you get... the squeeze box.
Right. So all these other colors were always there in the history of rock and roll. And Bridges to Babylon, I think for me, is quite remarkable in that it's making a concerted effort to get back to that. I think this is why they named it that way. It's like there's the, all the artwork of the album is the Stones standing astride these ruins.
Literally the Tower of Babel, and a lot of that
ruined golden
Sumerian
age.
Yeah, and that it's sort of this again, the hubris element that they're very aware. And to me this translated into what I believe is the most beautiful and the best set for a live show.
Yeah.
Oh my Lord. Like the winged the sphinxes and everything like that. It's just staggering to think that they had 3 of those going around the country, because if you don't know this, the Stones have 3. They used to do it. They leapfrog with 2 stages now, but they used to have 3.
Right.
One would be being torn down, they'd be playing on another, and another would be being built in the next city. That's how they did it.
Yeah, because the only way to get enough crew was to hire a local crew in each town to be building the stage in advance before the band got there.
Yeah, and so you will not see rock tours done like this.
No.
I do not believe ever again.
No. It is literally a bygone era now. We can't, live music is still like bigger than recorded music as far as the industry goes, but this is the maximum of all maximum possible production value that you're ever going to see.
Yeah. So anyway, about the point is that I believe, and I'm willing to defend this and risk. Don't at me, but don't please don't come up to me on the street and give me a hard time about this. But I believe that you have to see. If you look at the whole thing and you go back to the 50s and you know the whole history of 20th century music, I don't know how you can interpret punk as anything other than a huge step backwards.
Yeah, really kind of anti-progressive in all senses.
Yeah, and another thing that needs to be said is that in the late 70s when punk and metal were fighting over who would inherit the legacy of rock and roll.
Yeah.
The punks mostly just called the metal guys gay. And there was a gay scene in metal, totally. That's fine. But the way that they shamed everybody else and just were so hostile. But the fact is, punk has not yielded a real musical thing. Now, when I'm saying this, I'm talking about the New York and London thing. California punk is basically just surf music.
Right.
And I don't
played faster and louder.
I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
I really don't. It's doo-wop with power chords. Fine. Great. Great. It's very musical, and I think that what people are missing about that is that that's more in line. Certainly, like, what were the Ramones trying to do? They were a surf band. They wanted to go back to that thing of the 50s. They just didn't really know how.
Right. So it came across kind of, this sort of 4 to the floor, very square rhythm, whereas rock and roll's always had more swing to it. And I think, you look at the players on Bridges to Babylon, there's some, pretty serious jazz influence in those musicians' pedigrees.
Yes, anyone who really wants to pay attention will notice that there's an upright bass on Flip the Switch, which is the fastest until Rough Justice. It was the fastest Rolling Stones song.
Jeff Sarley is the bass player on that. He's playing an upright, like, double bass.
Yeah. Just to finish that thought, Flip the Switch beat Rip This Joint by like 1 or 2 BPM, and then Rough Justice beat it by something on a Bigger Bang beat it.
There you go, train spotters. Count those BPMs.
This is important if you're making a mix. Then the other thing I would have to say that we should talk about is the omnipresence of the video for Anybody See My Baby.
Right.
Because Anybody See My Baby is not... It's very interesting to listen to Bridges to Babylon all the way through, because it's about half a very rootsy, moody thing. And I'm not just singling out Keith's tracks, though most of them are his, but something like Already Over Me or Always Suffering. I mean, these are timeless.
Yeah, very, very kind of singer-songwriter influenced ballads. With, mixed vocal delivery and lyrics on them are great.
Yes, some of the best lyrics, especially Always Suffering. I've seen people talk about that a lot ever since I was on the Sticky Fingers Journal email newsletter, which was my introduction to the Rolling Stones fandom. If anyone else remembers that, please tell me, because otherwise I think I was just emailing,
a phantom in the night,
400-pound hacker sitting on his bed. But anybody see my baby? I mean, I don't know what the problem was. And I know people who have no problem with Miss You, who suddenly get all snarly when it comes to that one.
I think it might just be a case of them being overplayed on the radio, which is certainly not the band's fault, but both of those songs were really big hits and got a lot of airtime. And I think maybe people got sick of them.
And I think that for some people, it's about where they are in their life. When that's a big thing, like Led Zeppelin has never provoked this kind of atavistic response in me that it does in a lot of people that I know. I do not have the Led Zeppelin gene. I have the Rolling Stones gene. I have, I don't know. I find Anybody See My Baby is a fantastic production.
And I love the call out, to the 5 boroughs.
Yeah,
in the middle. That's great.
I'm gonna adapt that for Toronto, and he would adapt it. He would always adapt it.
That's right. They did it for South America on the most recent Ole Ole tour.
And that's another fantastic little point. There is that South America got into the Stones in the 90s, so they will always do "You Got Me Rocking" like a Rolling Stone.
Out of control,
for
sure.
And Anybody See My Baby? They will always do those down there because they did so well for them.
Yeah. And that Bismarck Key sample, I don't know if it's because the radio edit chops out some of it or whatever, but it's a real left turn for a band to sample an a cappella hip hop beatboxer, with the Rolling Stones kind of past history of working with black musicians and this is something that's...
But is it? Because Mick claims to have done the first dance edit ever when he did Miss You, and he says that looking back now, what he was trying to do was a hip-hop delivery on Miss You. That thread has always been in there, and you can look at Black and Blue where they start to try and do reggae numbers with Billy Preston. There's sort of some fumbling towards it, but it's really only until this record that they actually get it right. No, it's true. It's a lot more authentic, and certainly You Don't Have to Mean It is a much better executed take on reggae than Cherry O Baby, as much as I like that, or some of the other ones on Black and Blue.
So why don't we take a quick break here, and then we'll just break everything down track by track on the album.
Station break.
Thanks for checking out Under the Radar, a Rolling Stones podcast. I'm Tim Lindsay. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. We'll have some more for you very shortly about the Bridges to Babylon album and many more Rolling Stones deep cuts and hot cookies. If you'd like to send us your feedback or a question, send it to rollingstonespodcast@gmail.com. Okay, we're back, and we're just going to break it down. We talked a little bit about Flip the Switch already and Anybody See My Baby, so why don't we move on to Lowdown?
Okay, Lowdown is, I don't know, if I had to pick one track from this record, aside from if I can't take all of side 4...
Yeah. Right, all the Keith jams, yeah.
If I can't have that, then I would say, Lowdown is... I love the extended metaphor of the news. What he's really talking about here is fake news. That's what he's talking about. He's saying,
suddenly current again. Yeah.
Yeah. He's like, don't give me the fake news. Don't give me the Deza. I want the real news. Where is the real news? Yeah. That's all he's asking. But the horns, the arrangement, and it's kind of like the third in the cycle from Wicked as It Seems, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, off Keith's record.
You got Wicked as It Seems, and then Mick hears that and goes, well, that's not how you do it. I'll show you how you do it. And he writes Love is Strong.
Yeah.
And then Lowdown seems to be kind of another iteration in that same area.
It does sort of feel like the same territory Keith would have done with the Winos. There's a lot of Blondie Chaplin on this track. I think that's him playing that crazy bass part, that sort of dive bombs all over the place.
The bass on that is nuts, and the horns and everything. And definitely there's a lot of Blondie in there. Blondie Chaplin, let me tell you, if you have not gone to see Brian Wilson, I know you might be dissuaded by the fact that everybody sits down in that show and everyone claps along to Surfer Girl and stuff. But Wild Honey, it's
come on.
that really put a pepper in some people's palate when we thought, like, I was not ready for that. He is an absurdly good musician.
Yeah, Blondie Chaplin is the man. And he joins the band, basically, on this record. And he's all over all these tracks. He's in the band on the live show from this point until the end of the Bigger Bang tour in 2007. Basically, 10-year period where he's almost on stage the whole show.
Fantastically underrated guy there. Very probably second only to Ron Wood as to having like one of the most storied resumes in rock history.
Then you've also got Waddy Wachtel from the Winos playing third guitar on this track.
Yeah, Waddy also, if you don't know, he was one of those West Coast session guys.
Yeah.
He played on the Linda Ronstadt records.
Oh, so good.
He's astoundingly good. Very good player. So yeah, Lowdown is a wonderful song. I love the horn parts, and to me, it's like, yeah, there's that Winos element, but the horns also kind of takes me back to the mid 70s. It's almost like maybe Exile, but maybe more Munich Hilton thing. I don't know. It's Luxury maybe is what it reminds me of. I don't know for some reason. But Lowdown is a wonderful track. Is there anyone else interesting on that?
Let's see here. Horn players, obviously you got sax, and Jim Keltner plays a lot of the percussion parts on these tracks.
Jim Keltner's on this record a lot.
So he plays shaker in this. He's also a very well known session player with a large resume.
And if anyone hasn't heard the Charlie Watts Jim Keltner project, which came out of edits from this, you can actually hear they use the drum tracks from Flip the Switch as one song.
Really?
Oh yeah, you can blatantly hear it. It's all this like, it's very weird because it's this combination of like, it almost sounds like Air or Saint Germain or one of those 90s things.
Okay, yeah.
But it's made out of, it's basically what Charlie Watts and Jim Keltner were doing in the downtime when other things were happening, because they booked both of the studios, and the way the Stones book studios is that they buy them in the month.
Yeah,
because they don't want somebody else to book the session and tear the whole thing apart.
Sure,
because that's what you have to do when you're working in analog, and when you write in the studio, and when you're a millionaire, and when you're the Rolling Stones. So
there would be work happening in both the live rooms simultaneously, and if there was a gap where both the other lead guys were playing somewhere else, then Charlie and Keltner would
edit or put something together, yeah. Because also another thing that happened, I can't believe I just remembered this. Charlie Watts did not understand hip hop too well during the making of this record, and when Mick came in and he had these loops and things like that, in order to make it more understandable to him, Don Watts actually made him drum along to The Chronic by Dr. Dre.
Right.
So somewhere out there are drum tracks of Charlie Watts playing along to The Chronic. Wow. Internet. Yeah. I very rarely ask for things, but
the call out to you.
If you can find the Charlie Watts version of The Chronic, oh man,
that would be lit.
Yeah, it would be
all word. Yeah,
lit is exactly the right word. So let's move on. What's the next?
Yeah, the next track is the last one on side A. If you're a vinyl person, it's called "Already Over Me." So this is one of those moody ballads we were talking about earlier. Very kind of hard on his sleeve performance from Mick.
Yeah, and I think that this is definitely reflective of the fact that he and Jerry Hall were coming apart.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of elements of this sort of stormy relationship that's throughout Mick's lyrics on this album, and I'm sure a lot of it had to do with their impending breakup.
Yeah, because I think Mick was also obsessed with Angelina Jolie at this point, and chasing her all over the place.
Baby in Anybody Seen My Baby video.
Yeah, my favorite thing about that is Ron Wood as the MC. We should have talked about that more, but like, has anybody seen it? Woody, we were robbed of the acting career that Ron Wood clearly could have had. If Guy Ritchie were around, he would have definitely... There's an idea. Guy Ritchie, put Ronnie Wood in a movie. There you go. Perfect. There's a movie for you. Anyway.
So, anything else notable about this track you want to say? I think Don Was is the bass player. He was co-producing with Mick and Keith over the...
So this is Don Was' second record with the Stones, and it's worth mentioning about Voodoo Lounge. It's very funny that people write off these 90s records, but Voodoo Lounge is not only the only... It's the first one that Don Was produced, but it's not only the only time the Stones ever won a Grammy. They won 2.
Yeah.
That, speaking of videos too, I mean, the Love is Strong video was one of the first things. It was the Windows 95 ad and Love is Strong that were my introduction to the band. So, depending on who you were, and I knew a lot of young people too who thought, oh, that video is really cool. They're running around in New York and they're giant. So I think that the video thing was like, if you were older, if you were like a cynical teenager, like late teenager or in your 20s or something like that, and you saw the Stones and you're a grunge person especially, you're going to see these videos and you're going to go, oh, that's not cool. It's like rapping Grandma or something like that.
Well, I remember seeing the video, particularly with Mick like singing into the two-way subway communicator.
I love that
it's pretty
too.
great.
Yeah.
So any other thing you want to note about Already Over Me?
I really like the lyric to Already Over Me. I like the solo that descends, Woody's solo there. That's just that's a cool thing.
It's Benmont Tench from the Heartbreakers playing the Hammond on this, Hammond B3 organ, or C3 organ, I think it is. And Ronnie plays that cool dobro lick as well.
And he plays a B-bender on this, doesn't he?
I think it's a baritone he's actually playing. On the credits, that's what it says. I don't know if that's accurate.
It says baritone? I know there's a baritone on Thief in the Night because you have to hit that low T, but I thought there was a B-bender on one of these.
Anyway, it's worth noting that Chuck Leavell is not credited on any of these tracks, so I don't know if
No, Chuck Leavell's on You Don't Have to Mean It, isn't it?
I thought that was him. No, that's Clinton Clifford playing organ on that.
Okay.
So I don't know what he was doing, but like you'd think,
he'd be there.
They had Chuck and Daryl on every track on Voodoo Lounge, and yet they, I guess they just wanted to change it up on this record.
And that's one of the things about Bridges to Babylon that I do find so interesting is that they actually they almost never do this, but they actually did the kind of like, okay, we're going to go to LA and we're going to jam you up with session people and we're going to use all the hot producers. They did more. If you look at the way a hip hop record was done, there was basically a new producer. It's different. Like Dr. Dre or somebody would be the executive producer because not only is he the artist, he put up the money for it. It's coming out on his label because he's been in a lab with a pen and a pad and all that. But
he's the arbiter of the overall
session. And he's the ultimate tastemaker. And I'm sure they sit down there and say, look, we're going to rap about the quality of our weed and we do not love the women we have sex with and all this stuff. And they define the parameters of what the record is going to be.
Yeah.
And
it's very similar to Mick and Keith and Don Voss's, overall role in these sessions. But for each track, they'll draft in another producer to...
But then the difference is that for every track, they bring in a producer, and I would really say that this person is probably doing a role. You're called a producer, but in any other facet of the music industry, you'd probably call what that person was doing arranging.
Sure.
Because what they're doing is devising the beat, they're unraveling the mood of the song.
So that brings us to Gunface, which is, in this case, Danny Saber production.
Yeah, so that's what they did here is everyone gets their own. Now, Gunface is more overtly like... It's a very angry song.
Yeah, and it's super aggressive live, sounding guitar tone. Ronnie's slide solo is really bit crushed or whatever.
No, it's that shotgun mic.
Yeah,
thingy.
yeah.
If you see, there's pictures. There's a documentary on YouTube. There's a bit of a documentary on YouTube about the making of Bridges to Babylon, and you can see they're in Studio A, and they basically built this huge tent for the drum kit to dampen it. So that because it's a huge Studio A is the big room and it's designed to fit an entire orchestra in there. And then, so what you do with a rock record, you don't really want that much ring. Like, if you remember, if anyone can call to mind the sound of the drums in Bridge Over Troubled Water, where they actually put them in the echo chamber. You typically don't want that.
Yeah, not for, your general basic rhythm track, maybe as a special effect, but when you're just cutting the basic bed tracks, that's not an appropriate tone.
Yeah, so you want to dampen these things to make the crack of the drums and the way that just the hit of it rather than just kind of washing it out.
Yeah.
So
and you really hear that on Gunface. There's the snap of that snare, which is incredible.
It's also worth pointing out that because of splitting up the two studios, some of the drums probably happen, and indeed many people who track at Ocean Way prefer the sound of Studio B, which is a smaller, darker room off the main room. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's entirely likely for the more sequenced ones, especially, that they were probably Studio B.
Right.
And that the more live ones are Studio A.
So you'd put Gunface in the B category.
The smaller room. Right. I believe. I obviously I wasn't there. I am just speculating, but I have reason.
Well, that makes sense because there is that sort of that keyboard loop that Saber plays, which is sort of in the background. It seems like they were cutting it to maybe mixed demo had that loop on it already.
Yeah, and I think that some of the demo. You're also talking now where home user audio stuff does start to come into play here. Now, this goes back to the 70s because Woody apparently is one of the first people, Glyn Johns in his
He's the
book.
original bedroom producer, Woody.
He really is. Ron Wood blazed that trail. He was basically like Caractacus Potts in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but with a lot more drugs and audio gear. But he was one of the first people to commission any outboard gear. And I was saying, oh, what was it? Was it like Neve or whatever? He probably found somebody who worked at Olympic or Trident.
One of the big British studios, as you know.
Yeah, and they just
recorded at.
And you just say, "Make me some gear," right? That's it goes back to the tradition of the man in the shed who tinkers, right? Like this is so. Now, in those days, when you had McCartney and Woody and all these people doing this, they had 4 tracks at home, 4-track tape, and that would have actually been a pretty straightforward workflow that could yield some impressive results. But when you're getting into early digital in the 90s. It's a very laborious and intense process because computing power isn't really there.
Right.
So people may be working on DATs. They may be working on...
early iterations of Pro Tools, maybe.
Yeah, maybe if they're really... Like, Mick has a pretty advanced home studio, which you can see in the Being Mick documentary from...
2000...
Goddess in the Doorway.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he's been... Obviously, these people have reasons to be invested in this gear, but now we're getting to the point where you can produce more advanced demos instead of like, oh, I did this scratch track of a guitar and a vocal and something like that.
Which is the way Mick and Keith would write a lot of the times, was they would demo the tracks sort of on acoustics or with Mick playing drums or something while Keith played.
They really invented this. I mean, Exile on Main Street is not just Exile on Main Street, but the whole like recording in Stargroves or at the Wick or at Redlands, because Jumping Jack Flash came out of Redlands. You know that Keith was fooling with the Nagra. Everybody had some version of this, and the 1972 version of what we all consider to be the dream, which is getting in a van, going up to the cottage and tracking something, would have been a console built into the back of an Airstream trailer.
Sure,
and that's what the Rolling Stones mobile is. But anyway, the point is, we're trying to talk about British Babylon.
So Gunface is sort of the next kind of evolution, you would say, in that kind of home recording plus studio technique style. And on those merits, I think it does stand up because it's really interesting, swinging backbeat against that really rigid, computerized loop.
Yeah, the other interesting thing about the writing there, and Bob pointed this out when we were listening to it, is that...
Our friend Bob Parker of...
of CBC fame. And he was saying that when you first hear the song and you get to what is actually the pre-chorus or the B section, you think that that's the chorus.
Yeah.
So it's almost has the effect of having 2 choruses because you think it's hit its peak at the I have invented her, but now she acts so chic section. But then kind of like you think you've got the most that the song's going to do, and then it goes up another level.
Sure. Still
fairly early on. So it's kind of exciting, and I really do like that slide solo that Woody plays, but we should probably get on to the next track.
Yeah, so the next one is You Don't Have to Mean It. It's the first Keith lead vocal on this album. And, all the backing players that you could imagine from Keith's kind of crew are involved here. There's the horn section again, but Clinton Clifford, as I mentioned, is playing the Hammond B3, pretty famous Jamaican keyboard player.
Yeah, that organ intro is worth the price of admission alone. So this being the first Keith song, we should kind of go back and mention that Flip the Switch is 100% Keith's writing. It's about the Hale Bop cult, but it's Mick singing. And so is Too Tight. So sometimes Keith writes a song 100% himself, but still thinks it's a Mick, so still considers it a Rolling Stones Mick song.
Yeah.
Sometimes Keith opts to sing himself. And so You Don't Have to Mean It should be singled out there because there is a ton of Keith writing. And I would say that if you're a big fan of Keith and you've been shying away from British Babylon because you've heard it's all bleep borp and hip hop, realize that that's only about 50% of the case, and that it's also 50% of Keith's probably strongest material.
I would say so, yeah. And it was great when they played this live to see Ronnie playing the keyboards. Like he would do that piano offbeat part on stage.
When they pulled it out on the Licks tour. I don't know if they did that on the Bridges to Babylon tour, but Blondie Chaplin would play guitar.
Yeah.
And Woody would play keyboards, and then you had the horn section and everything, and it was a different thing. It's kind of like when Bill Wyman would play the synthesizer on Fingerprint File, and Woody would play bass, and then Mick would play guitar. They've been screwing around in that way, but yeah, You Don't Have to Mean It is also noteworthy because it started out, if you know the chords to it, it's very simple. If you play that with a kind of stiff 50s rock attitude, it is a Buddy Holly song. You'll realize it is, and you can even hear it in that kind of like hiccuping Buddy Holly vocal delivery. And so what he did, because it was written in Jamaica, there's a whole anecdote about it in Life. I'm sure everybody's read Life at this point, but it is 100%. It is so accurately a Buddy Holly song. It's almost disturbing that Keith was able to like put himself in that. But then
what really is the brilliance for me about it is the way Charlie plays the backbeat, because it's not a reggae drum part. He's not playing it, on the 3 or something like that. He's playing pretty much straight, but with enough kind of push and pull with Daryl Jones's bass part to give space for that offbeat on the keyboards.
It is certainly not the way like Sly Dunbar and Robbie Shakespeare would approach it.
Right. Who they had worked with before on Undercover. That's the sort of traditionalist reggae approach. This is more like roots reggae meets the Crickets.
Yeah, so if you kind of imagine that maybe in Lubbock, Texas, were close enough, or the radio broadcasts were getting down there, and we know that they were. There's a big country element to reggae that is kind of underappreciated, and back and forth in the kind of Gulf there.
That's rock and roll for you.
But if you imagine it as if Buddy Holly records had made it down to Jamaica and been interpreted that way, which I think is a fantastic exercise.
So let's talk a little bit about, I know this is a Deep Cuts podcast, and these were both singles, but maybe we can take them as a pair. The next 2 songs are Out of Control and Saint of Me. Kind of 2 sides of one coin, really. They sort of on the CD version anyway, they crossfade together. There's a side break here for the vinyl version.
That's true, and I always really did enjoy the crossfade. And yeah, it's kind of like Jumping Jack Flash, Child of the Moon, in that they're both a theme. Like, so Out of Control is very much, I've always compared it to Mick's Are You Not Entertained moment. It's like he's looking back over this life, and he's saying like, sure, I was young, I was foolish, I was out there, he was doing these crazy things, but he's kind of wondering. I assume, I'm guessing maybe it had something to do with the way Voodoo Lounge was received. Maybe it had something to do with the way people started people were endlessly the steel wheelchairs iteration of jokes. I love that they've actually been hanging in there so long that jokes about the Stones being old are now just played out and old, and no one cares about it. But
everybody kind of talks about how the bass line on this is sort of copped from Pop is a Rolling Stone by the Temptations, but it has other rhythmic and melodic antecedents as well.
It's true, and Papa Was a Rolling Stone is a one chord kind of thing, whereas actually I think the whole B section, so Mick tends to write songs in this structure. If you listen to Beast of Burden or Out of Control or Don't Stop, what's interesting about them is that the verse and chorus happen over the same figure.
Yeah.
Right? The riff doesn't change there. It's only the melody.
The voicing over top.
But what he does instead is that he has other sections between them, right? So in Beast of Burden, it's the Am I Rough Enough? Am I Hard Enough? Right? That's between the verse and the chorus. And it's kind of like, okay, we're going up somewhere, but you're really just taking them back and makes the original theme sound fresh. Don't Stop takes this kind of to another direction because it actually has 2 bridges. And I think they're both really excellent. And Mick is really good at writing bridges. So that's how he creates variety.
Yeah. And what Out of Control really does is it establishes kind of a showstopper for the live show, because this is, such a great moment of drama.
Yeah, and I my first exposure to this was the 97 St. Louis
the TV
pay-per-view.
Yeah.
So like from the minute Keith burst on stage wearing the leopard coat, draped around his shoulders like he's Don Corleone in some John Waters movie, And they did Satisfaction, and then I was just hooked. And then when he gets to, and again, like the new stuff was blended in with the old stuff, and no one was sitting there telling me, "Oh, this is a new song, it sucks," right? So when he puts on the silver shimmery jacket thing, and he starts to perform this song, like Mick really acts this one out.
Definitely, yeah.
And so again, we skipped over Anybody Seen My Baby, but a really fascinating thing I read from Don Was in a recent interview is that Mick actually writes essays on the characters and motivations for every one of his songs.
That doesn't really surprise me, because it does seem like he puts a lot of care and thought into how he performs on stage, no matter what the setting is. Like, even just like how he puts the outfits together for, each number is like pretty carefully thought through.
And what color, and like he talks about this a lot. He says, Satisfaction has a dance, Jumping Jack Flash has a dance, like that there are attitudes and there are expressions that come with these songs and their stories and their characters. And he says, he's talked about, it's like Satisfaction is very much written from my perspective as me, and it's about the way I was feeling at this time, whereas Jumping Jack Flash is more this archetypal character who's been through the mill, and it's about survival, and it's much more abstract. Like, he can tell you this stuff. It isn't just gibberish. But anyway, the point of this is story, I can't remember what this was, but apparently it was down to the point where, like, Don Was says, is this character, are you wistful at this moment, or are you sentimental, or are you angry? And Mick opens up this essay and goes through it, and because he's read the story and reminds himself of what happened in the half an hour the 5 minutes or something leading up to where the song is happening. So that's something, especially if you are a singer struggling to get a better vocal performance out of yourself, try something like that. Really think about who's talking there and what's going on. It is so much more important than what mic you're using or anything else like that. I'm just saying that because we're audio nerds and I like to give free advice. But anyway.
So then by contrast, Saint of Me is, it is a character song, and, it's obviously like some of the numbers that they did on Steel Wheels. It's kind of, drops the historical references in order to make a point about a relationship or about a feeling or,
Yeah, and so this is also another one that was probably produced somewhat at Mick's home and somewhat in the studio. And this does actually show you a lot about where Mick's writing comes from, because like there's the vulgar kind of guttural side that we're all very familiar with and everyone's seen. This is like, it is like Blinded by Love in that he's going back and telling this story more about life and morality.
Yeah.
Like the guy in Ole Ole Ole, the guy there, the samba artist there, when he's talking about the Stones, it's like, I was right in sync with him. He's like, the Stones music is about life and death and struggle,
heaven and hell,
redemption, right?
Sympathy for the devil.
Yeah, it's not just like, okay, you look at Chuck Berry's music. I'm not trying to reduce it or anyway, but I'm just saying, like, Chuck Berry's music is about an idea of America.
Right.
It's about a very specific time and a very specific location. It's for people at a period in their life. The Stones, as Keith says, it's like they're real life and theater at the same time. It is the lie that tells the greater truth. It's more like a mythological landscape than it is, say, a personal narrative. Like a lot of other, like there are people who are more literary, like Leonard Cohen, and they write their personal stories and they put them into music. Whereas this is
it's a more abstract construction.
So Saint of Me is, again, from the point, interestingly enough, they both deal with people who have like, and again, like Jumping Jack Flash, who have been through a lot, who have seen these things, they've indulged themselves, they've also abstained, they've tried these especially Saint of Me, it's like, it's about doing, you've given yourself to one aspect of life, hoping to find meaning there, and the reverse happened. All those saints that he talks about, there were people who led very indulgent lives and then
found the light.
Yeah, so this is maybe about but what's also interesting about this is that he's not just lecturing you with something about how you need to get religion. Like he's saying
I tried it wasn't for me.
All of these people, their spirituality in their life and these things happen to them at a time in their life when it actually, like, you can't get to heaven unless you've been through hell. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, so you can't. He's saying like, when it's time for me to accept this, it will be obvious, and anything else would be fake.
Right.
So that's the lyric. But it's also worth mentioning that this track has Billy Preston on it.
It does. He's the B3 Hammond player on this. It's a weird lineup, really. Pierre de Beauport, Keith's tech, is playing 6-string bass. In addition to Michelle de Giocello is playing the 4-string bass.
So there's layers of that. I think that what Pierre de Beauport is doing is maybe some of the chorded stuff.
Yeah.
They're probably treating it like a James Brown thing where you have two bass players. One of them is playing the root, and like Michelle's bass line there is fantastic.
Yeah, she's an amazing producer and singer-songwriter in her own
Her
right.
records are really great.
Yeah. But Keith sits this one out. He doesn't play any guitar.
I think, he gives it over to Waddy Wachtel. And what's always interesting is that when it comes to the tour, he's always willing to play these.
Right.
He does a great job of it. If you hear the No Security version, if anyone knows that, he always turns in a good. It's just another great gospel style vamp for them to do. It's I don't know what was going on there. Maybe it was maybe he was too busy. I don't know. This is a funny story from the making of this record that Whiskey Town was recording in either during the rehearsals in New York or in Ocean Way. And the drummer from Whiskey Town did not recognize Charlie Watts, and as a result did not show deference. And Keith was angry about this.
Right.
And apparently chased the guy around the halls of the studio with a broken vodka bottle for hours or something like that. So there's a fun anecdote about this.
Well, we're about halfway through the record. We've been going for about an hour, so maybe we'll take another break.
Sure.
And then we'll finish up the back half. So we're back after our short break. We're here, and it's Under the Radar, a Rolling Stones podcast about deep cuts and hot cookies. And once again, I'm Tim Lindsay.
And I'm Christian Bonner.
And when we last left off, we sort of, did the back-to-back singles on the record, which was, I guess Out of Control isn't, really recognized at the time so much as a big single, but it's certainly a standout track from the album. And then, of course, Saint of Me, which had the music video and
which is a great video.
Yeah, somewhat controversial track, but it is a really cool song. And now we're on to the sort of the back half of the record, or as Christian calls it, the apotheosis.
Yeah. So we're getting into Might As Well Get Juiced. And Might As Well Get Juiced is normally the point where if there are any older fans in the room, that they're going to leave or turn it off. Because synthesizers scare them. Yeah,
and it starts with a pretty aggressive sort of production technique, which is that very delayed kind of hip-hop sounding synthesizer drone.
Yeah, and so my first experience with the Rolling Stones, really, I mean, I'd obviously heard their songs, but I went to see them on the No Security tour, and they used a instrumental remix of Might As Well Get Juiced as their walk-on song, and that had an astounding impact on me the first time you hear that
sub bass
thing.
It's almost like a WWE walkout track.
It was very much like that. They did the whole thing, the whole opening video is them walking through I don't know where they shot it, but it's supposed to look like they're coming through the industrial unfurnished part of the stadium,
right?
And they get in an elevator,
and
then they come up, and then that motif is kind of repeated because, again, Out of Control on that tour, Mick did it inside a cage, and he would break out of the cage.
Right.
It's funny that there's so little documentation of the No Security tour. Because I know that there's a lot of people who really, really like it. And
it's been rumored as one of the From the Vault shows that they might have on video. They might clean it up someday. I would really appreciate that.
The whole thing has been shot, and the definitive bootleg of that tour, there are two. There's Toronto, February 25th, 1999, my first concert ever, and there's San Diego. So anyway, we just have to say that we want to do that, but we really want to talk about Might As Well Get Juiced. And what's cool about it is that it's equal parts. Somebody said that Honky Tonk Woman is equal parts country and blues, like one of those lenticular cards of Jesus where he's on the cross and he's happy, So this is the same sort of thing. It's like equal parts hip hop and blues. And Keith has this. Keith is always like, "Oh, I saved the rehearsal take," that's just pure blues and I like it better. And I'm saying, Keith, if you have this, like, let us judge.
Yeah.
I want to hear it.
Let the people hear for themselves. And you know what, though? I do like that it has, you know what, hip hop's backbeat and, you know, its use of big reverbed and delayed synthesizer tones and everything owes a lot to kind of the rock and new wave rock that, you know, those sort of textures became fashionable again in the 90s. A lot of people were going back and sampling people like Gary Newman, Kraftwerk, all these bands that were using primitive synthesizer tones just because it sounded great through a big sound system.
And the drum sounds on that are like almost claustrophobically close to you. Like it is.
It's like When the Levee Breaks in a sort of backbeat.
That's true, and it is a performance, but I think it's processed to the point where it's supposed to sound like it's sampled.
Yeah,
and there may be some looping elements. It's probably something that came out of mixed demo studio at home or something like that. It's also. He quotes Tumbling Dice.
Yeah.
What's this crazy game? 6s, 7, 8s, 9s.
Yeah, so there's some element there of the might as well get juiced line being a sort of, well, you can indulge your habit. You know,
yeah, because
let yourself off the leash.
Only a person with adult children that have left the house could have written that song. And I think that that's another reason why it sets older fans off so much, because they start thinking, oh, Mick Jagger can't be old because that means I'm old. He said that. Somebody posted that recently because it was his birthday. You know, Mick said, you know, they want you to be the same as you were in 1969 because if you've grown old, then that means they've grown old.
Right.
And I think that explains, like, Tim and I are both in our 30s, and so looking back at this, like as I've been saying, Bridges to Babylon was one of my first. It was very current. It was the newest one when I first got into the Stones, and so like my parents weren't really into the Stones. I mean, they were, but they weren't like fans, and they didn't constantly tell me, you know, oh, this is you have to like Exile on Main Street, but you can't like Go to Said Soup, or you can't like this, and you know, there's a lot of older fans do that, and they just want you to hate what they hate. And so I didn't ever really have that, and it was the maturity of Bridges to Babylon that spoke to me, because when you're 14, you want to be in the adult world. So what's more adult than than
going out and getting stoned?
No, but it's like divorce is a prominent theme on the record.
Yep.
And that's something you kind of have to deduce.
Yeah.
From a lot of the lyrics.
But strife in the marital bliss section of the protagonist's life is certainly a motivator here.
Yeah, it's not kind of like the usual rock and roll thing of just like we're going to talk about cars and girls and getting f***ed up. Like there's a lot of texture and there's a lot of depth to it that I think is underrated because people just go, oh, I don't want the Stones to use synthesizers.
But what you have here now, and like this album stands astride, again, that classic era of experimentation and also the intervening years of influence. So you have Doug Wimbish playing bass guitar through a very modern sounding setup and those crazy sort of pedals that
it's an auto
whammy
wah
of some kind.
It's an auto wah or envelope filter, which
Yeah.
Wimbish is pretty adept at using.
And I know he was Mick's pick to replace
Bill Wyman.
Wyman. So
the relationship between people don't really appreciate this, but Living Colour, no one wanted to sign Living Colour because a black hard rock metal band didn't make sense to people.
Right.
And Living Colour is great if you haven't heard them. And the only reason their first record, Mick Jagger paid to get their first record made, and then just said because no one would invest in them, and he just said, "Look, I've made it's done now.
Yeah,
just put this out." And also Bernard Fowler was kind of associated. I bet you that's how it's somehow through those guys because they're all part of the same kind of New York session people.
Yeah,
crew
circuit. Yeah,
yeah, and. So Wimbish, the thought of Wimbish being in the Stones is certainly like really cool. Not that like I love Daryl Jones.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have been that different, really.
Yeah, I think there would have been a few more tracks that sound like this. They're a little bit outre in the bass department, whereas I think Daryl plays very tastefully and somewhat conservatively compared to what we know he's capable of doing. You know, most of the time he sits in the pocket, and that's very hard to do, and I admire him for it. But Wimbish has a lot more embellishment further up the neck and with all those effects and things that he uses that, I mean, occasionally having a few more tracks like that in the catalog mixed in might have mixed things up a bit better, but you know, a lot of people didn't care for it at all, and a lot of people hate this song. So
yeah, and we're just trying to say that they're wrong.
The last song on side 3, Always Suffering, is real epic in terms of production value.
Really excellent lyrics to this
Yeah.
song. Absolutely excellent lyrics. Probably of the, it's close to like the Hank Williams thing of like saying incredibly complex emotion with very simple lyrics.
Yeah.
And it is poetic and there is some abstraction in it, but it's not like Adele lyrics or Bob Dylan lyrics that are just gibberish and people spend their lives trying to find the meaning of them. Like many people have pointed out, I wouldn't be the first person to say this, many people have said Always Suffering is a song about divorce. And that it's probably about ending his relationship with Jerry Hall. But I don't know. I always have time for the song. I always think that it works for me. I don't think I've ever skipped over it.
No, it is so mature in its approach that you kind of wonder for a second, like, is this actually the Rolling Stones? Like, this is something like that they don't often attempt in terms of emotional depth. And
interestingly enough, I think that it actually kind of prefigured the territory that we ended up in on A Bigger Bang. Because a lot of A Bigger Bang, there's certainly stuff that is
harkening back to the kind of rip-roaring juvenile.
There definitely is that stuff on A Bigger Bang, but there's always hidden now towards the end. Like on Voodoo Lounge, it's a combination of Blinded by Rainbows and Baby Break It Down that are that's the real truth, and they're always hidden towards the end of the record,
right? Because
you have to do a certain amount of work. If you put them too early on the record, you wouldn't feel like you earned them.
Yeah.
So this is where I think Tim and I both in agreement here that the sequencing of Bridges to Babylon is really, really, really important in how it tells its story.
And this is something actually Don Voss doesn't get any credit for at all. Like, you can totally disagree with us if you don't like the way he gets sounds or you don't like the way he, encourages the Stones to write. Fine, you're entitled to your opinion, but Don Voss knew exactly what he was doing when he took this crazy, epic mountain of session tapes that they had spun out over the course of the months that they were recording this record and distilled it down to this 1 hour of very diverse but cohesive songwriting and production value.
No, I know that I'm a zealot for the Stones, but like this record is so important for me. I've always tried to emulate its eclecticism because I think there's something really interesting that happens when you have a bunch of different styles of music and you leave the audience. You have to be a good producer in order to make them all sound like they're from the same record. That usually happens somewhere around mixing or the overdubs. But I think that there's something interesting that happens when you force your audience to find the connections between, this kind of snarling, aggressive rock and then more like moody, down-tempo R&B and these ballads. When you really start to... none of their records are concept records. Maybe Satanic Majesties. But there's something that happens when you imply a narrative without actually stating it. Really, Bridges to Babylon is the closest thing they've ever done to XL on Main Street. It absolutely is.
Yeah, having the thread that carries over 4 sides of record, really.
I was just complaining about this. The idea that XL on Main Street is somehow about the itinerant music of the 30s is just wrong. It doesn't sound anything like that. Like,
if anything, it sounds more like the 50s, like the stuff that's live off the floor, not stuff like Let
Rip
It Loose
This Joint.
But Rip This Joint, even Tumbling Dice to a certain extent, like, it sounds like a band in a tiled room, which is essentially what it is, and what all those 50s recordings that they loved were.
Yeah, and like,
this doesn't. It sounds like a very well treated, like acoustically perfect room.
Yeah,
with a really good band playing.
So I guess that's all we can say about Always Suffering, but I could talk about that forever. The other thing that I want to mention is that there's a fantastic song that was cut from Bridges to Babylon.
Yes.
Called Any Way You Look at It.
Yeah. Later a B-side.
It's the B-side to Say to Me. I bought the single at Vortex Records just to hear this track, and it was later re-released on...
Rarities 71 to 2000, whatever.
Yeah, the Starbucks record, which is out of print now, too. Yeah. So if you want to hear Through the Lonely Nights or Any Way You Look at It...
You've got to buy the big 45 by 45s box set like I did, like a chump. Get all those remixes.
But where are you going to get the full fat remix of Out of Control? Or
Fat Controllers, Out of Control?
Yeah, any of those. Like, come on. You want those.
Yeah.
But anyway, check out anyway you look at it. And I think that the reason it was cut is not because it sucks or anything like that. That's a dumb opinion. But the reason is there are already 2 very strong ballads. 3 when you count How Can I Stop?
Yeah.
But there's always this idea, there's been a lot of discussion about the fighting and on this record, and I don't think that the fighting really started until they were more or less done. I think that Keith saying, "Oh, you stole Anybody Seen My Baby" from Katie Lang was just an attempt to obfuscate. And there's all this fighting about what the predominant theme of the record should be. And
which, in the end, I think, didn't they have Tom Stoppard come up with the name for the album? Like,
was it Tom Stoppard?
I think so. Somebody like that. Bridges to Babylon was
I know that somebody pitched something that Mick shortened to Bridges to Babylon.
Right. Yeah, that's probably what the case was, because Bridges to Babylon doesn't sound like a Stoppardism, but certainly something that he would have alluded to in, thinking about the themes behind this record.
No, and your point about for one thing, like the Tower of Babel, the whole story there is about urbanization.
Yeah.
So this record is a very
isolation.
Yeah, it's a very urban record. And I'm not using that to mean black or hip hop.
Right.
I mean,
that is literally the stupidest name for a genre in an industry that's full of them. So
yeah, it's like what music isn't made if recorded music happened in cities. Like you couldn't go field recordings in terms of commercial music. Nobody was going out and tracking anything in the wild, right? So you had to have... Anyway, this is
another tangent, but
this is another thing.
So anyway, let's move on to Too Tight. This is a track that leads off the last side of the vinyl version of the album.
Yeah, and this is a Keith song. My feeling is that the lyrics are 90% Keith, but it's funny because there aren't
a lot of...
Yeah, and Flip the Switch is very similar because it's a Keith
concept in
writing, but he still says, look, this is a Rolling Stone song. And Mick does the same thing, right? Like around the time of, I think it's that documentary Being Mick from around the time of Goddess in the Doorway, where he says, look, some of these things I write, because I think he wrote Don't Stop around the same time as everything from...
Might have demoed a whole bunch of songs that end up as being some of the 4 licks.
Yeah, recordings. And then he goes, okay, this is a Rolling Stones song, this is a Mick Jagger song, right? And Keith clearly does the same thing. So Too Tight is really interesting. It does have a kind of extended metaphor about knots, which is kind of corny, like if you really get down to it, but I do really I love the chord progression, I love the playing, I love the intro. It's a very, very underrated.
Yeah, the bridge, so good.
Yeah, the solo, everything. Yeah. Like Too Tight is a great song, and people really miss it. There's some really wonderful overdubs back and forth between. I think most of the playing is Keith. The solo sounds very much like Keith.
Yeah.
I don't even know if Woody's on that track.
I bet he is, probably just doing the kind of chugging rhythm thing off the top.
Yeah,
and he plays the pedal steel too. He's credited with pedal steel on this.
Oh, right, there is pedally steely stuff.
But yeah, it's Waddy and Keith, as most of the previous tracks were.
Yeah, so everybody, again, there's this palpable sort of frustration in the lyric. It's like, don't tell me what to do. Like, what's that line? I wrote that fucking song.
I wrote that fucking book, which apparently Mick did write a book about whatever went down in the 80s. So,
Yeah, and it's again, the theme that's in Out of Control and in Might As Well Get Juice is just like, what more do you want from us? Like, what on earth could we possibly do? Some of this, I wonder if it isn't a reaction to Voodoo Lounge. Because Voodoo Lounge, as much as Voodoo Lounge has new territory in it that the Stones didn't really do before, it's also one of the purest, most natural expressions of the Stones, because Steel Wheels has, very pronounced LA style late 80s production.
Yeah.
Undercover sounds like something from 1983. They're responding to things like Thriller.
Yeah.
It's maybe, even Some Girls, which, is now so old that it's considered just a timeless classic, is very much of the moment. It could have only come out in 77. So maybe...
Well, but we see that now with hindsight. We're now further away from Bridges to Babylon in time in 2017 than it was from Some Girls when it came out.
That's true. And yeah, in the 90s, I still remember there were plenty of people. I saw somebody who was trashing everything past XL on Main Street.
I guess he didn't listen to anything after Black and Blue.
But that's a good point too, because it's like Some Girls was controversial even in the 90s. Yeah. It was controversial to say Some Girls was a great record. It was maybe 50-50. Some people would say yes and some people would say no. And Tattoo You, yeah, still very unconventional as a pick for your favorite Stones record when I was... Now it's kind of considered the last good one that they did. But I was going to compare Tattoo You to Voodoo Lounge because Tattoo You isn't really of the moment. I know that since it came out, when you think of 1981, you think of Start Me Up. But Start Me Up was also recorded many years before that. It's just mixed to sound like 81. But it's like both of those records are just kind of like pure expressions of the Stones. They're not trying to make a comment on what's happening now. If Voodoo Lounge were really something that sounded like 94, it would have more grunge elements, or it would sound like a Mariah Carey record, and it just doesn't.
Yeah. And I don't think that this actually, Bridges to Babylon, a track like Too Tight, compared to other rock that was on the radio at the time, doesn't sound like Third Eye Blind, doesn't sound like Hanson.
No.
It's got a very live, in-the-room feel to it that was miles away from what other people were doing at the time. At the dawn of, like, the Pro Tools, everything is, like, cut and sliced to within an inch of its life with the comping of every instrument.
Yeah, so when you get into side 4, I think everything on side 4 is alive. I would be surprised actually if...
I think it's deliberately sequenced that way. But if you go back through to Out of Control and Saint of Me, those are mixed take on those songs. Whereas I think Keith kind of won the battle here for these last 3, and he was kind of allowed to have free reign. Too Tight has got, that interesting rhythmic thing going on with Charlie kind of offset between Keith and Waddy's rhythm. And you've got Ronnie floating over top. So there's a lot to dig into here just musically, and if you're studying how the rhythm section works for the Stones, you could do a lot worse than listening to the swing of this. I love that the turnaround after that bridge, instead of getting all that energy out in the bridge where it builds and builds to Mick swearing about writing a book, it doesn't go into a chorus, it drops back down into the bridge. So it climaxes, and then it comes back down.
Yeah, because it's a dynamic shift that you see a lot where the bridge, Mick uses it quite a lot, where the bridge leads into the solo.
Right.
I've spoken about this, the structure that he uses in Don't Stop. Same thing. Mm-hmm. But Don't Stop has 2 bridges. But yeah, Too Tight is super cool. It's clearly some kind of a live take that's been extensively overdubbed.
Because you've got Blondie playing piano and tambourine. You've got all the backup singers. Basically, all the players on the record sing backup on this. You've got Ronnie on electric and on pedal steel.
It's interesting because it almost, in terms of its tempo and its attitude, it's very similar to Flip the Switch, and it kind of harkens back to how we started this whole adventure.
And you have Jeff Sarley on upright again, or acoustic bass, rather, playing that on Too Tight.
That only proves my point further. And again, it being a Keith lyric sung by Mick. Too Tight is 100% Keith. He loves those extended metaphors. He loves to take, and I think it comes from blues, where you take one concept for your metaphor and you just expand upon it. Somebody said that, the way you write blues is you think of an object or a person, and then you think of 5 things you can do with it. The example was a knife. You can clean your nails with it. You can cook dinner. You can stab a man, right? So that's...
There's your verses right there. Just put them in the right order and you've got a story. Thanks for checking out Under the Radar, a Rolling Stones podcast. I'm Tim Lindsay. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. We'll have some more for you very shortly about the Bridges to Babylon album and many more Rolling Stones deep cuts and hot cookies. If you'd like to send us your feedback or a question, send it to rollingstonespodcast@gmail.com. We'll try and respond to it as soon as we can.
Okay, so moving on, what's after Too Tight is?
Well, of course, it's Thief in the Night, and back to back with that, How Can I Stop? And, it's really hard to even separate these, but it was a very last minute idea to sort of thematically put these two songs back to back in sequencing.
And even they only got Thief in the Night on the record because they had been finishing it at Keith's home studio, and then they actually took it via speedboat to New York to get it mastered or to get it into the mix session. There's a whole story about it. Keith says that he won't tell the whole the whole thing, but it's in his book that they were doing overdubs at his house or something like that, and then had to like smuggle it, rush it back via boat to get it onto the record. And yeah, so Thief in the Night is really interesting because it has a baritone guitar on it. Now, when you hear that opening riff, boom, 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 you cannot voice a D that low on an electric guitar
Regular tuning, yeah.
Unless you down tune or it's a baritone. So it was probably something that was played on the electric piano or something like that, and then, hey, that's great. But Keith has this sort of ideological bent against new ideas. And what's funny about that on Thief in the Night is because it has reverse cymbals. Clearly some element of it is looped.
Yeah.
Those things don't happen by accident. And then there's the baritone. And you will notice that Pierre de Beauport has writing credit on it.
And he's credited with playing the piano. So maybe that piano part that you're thinking about, the bum, 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 that might have been his contribution.
I have a feeling that that's what it was. And that Keith was like, that's the sound. That's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Now, Thief in the Night is really, for me, the ultimate Keith song.
Yeah, it's his version of Midnight Rambler. It's like from the perspective of Keith's kind of persona, I'm going to sneak in at night and take you is like the flip side to the the prancing Mick version of Midnight Rambler.
And the story behind this one is that he and Patty were fighting. Now that's the thing, is that he and Keith and Patty were having more issues during the actual making of the record, but Mick and Keith started fighting on the tour.
Right.
And so apparently Patty, who is very religious, started spending more and more time with her priest, kind of like on The Sopranos.
Sure.
And Keith got jealous. So the thief in the night, like that's a biblical allusion that Christ will come like a thief in the night. And there's a whole other podcast that we could bore you with about the religious themes on this record, or the religious themes throughout the Rolling Stones canon, because I think that there is something to discuss there.
There's a codex of iconography yet to be written.
Yes. But Thief in the Night is one of those things that the Stones get criticized a great deal for, and specifically this one, and indeed most music since the 80s. I've known a lot of older people who say it's all about production now, and it's not about performing and talent.
Or i.e., when did computers ruin music?
Yes.
Can you carbon date how late in the game you are after the computer revolution?
And I'm a guy I'm a producer before I'm even a musician. I'm a writer-producer before I'm a musician. I'm not very technically competent. I only use technique as a way to make it easy to express myself, because if you don't have technique at all, then you can't do anything. And I am constantly getting into these fights with people who tell me that, the kind of preamps you use and the gear you use doesn't matter, and where you track your record doesn't matter, because it's all about heart and emotion. And in the abstract, that's true. But I don't believe that there's even a difference between production and mixing and writing. Now, where did I get this idea? From Keith.
Yeah.
Right? It's very, very interesting to me that so many of those dudes from the 60s and 70s who invented the process that we used to call EQing, like when you close mic something and then you round it off with EQ, you take the low end out to blend it all together. That used to be called the Tamla Motown process, and now it's just called recording.
Yeah.
In the same way that overdubbing was a fancy new process that then became just called recording.
Yeah.
I would actually argue that it's more likely that more of Bridges to Babylon is properly live than Beggar's Banquet.
I would say so too, because a lot of Beggar's Banquet is built up over months and months of careful overdubbing.
Yeah, and so the distinction is that more of the band played on the live take in the 90s than would have on stuff from the 60s and 70s.
Because they had better technique.
They didn't have enough inputs.
Yeah.
They simply didn't have, you're talking about 8-track tape at the most.
Mm-hmm.
Even Beggar's Banquet was probably 4. But I don't know.
I don't really remember off the top of my head, but I feel like by that point they would have moved on to 8-track to get stuff like the choir on you can't always get.
Right.
But
the mixes are still very dense, and indeed they aren't even really mixes in the way that we know, because you just tracked it. Glenn Johns famously, Don Henley, when they were doing one of the Eagles records, I think it was Desperado, he's like, "Oh, can you turn the kick drum up a little?" And Glenn Johns said, "If you want there to be more kick, you play it louder." You know, that's not how we think about recording anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea, drum sounds benefited a great deal from us processing them more.
Right.
So the point is that we have the people who literally invented the music processes that we now use being condemned for using them.
Yeah, it's a strange.
Yeah,
it's a strange insight, but it's true. I mean, what Keith credits his engineer of choice on this record, Rob Fabroni, for is capturing the feeling of a live room. But the way he does that is actually with incredibly good miking technique. It's not as though he just finds the right room, puts a mic any place, and that's the record. He actually is very careful about capturing parts of the acoustic space with really accurate and precise miking technique. So when you hear stuff like the decay on the cymbals in How Can I Stop, that's the recording technique at hand. Like, that's the stuff that they were really working hard on in this record, and it shows. Like, it pays off. Everything sounds gorgeous and immediate, and there's no veil between you and the players. You can just sort of reach out and touch them almost.
Yeah, there's something really, really magical about those last 2 songs. And like we were saying about Saint of Me, Out of Control, it's again the kind of like Jumping Jack Flash, Child of the Moon dichotomy, in that A Thief in the Night is kind of like, yeah, I'm cool and I'm going to go out there and do all this stuff and you're going to see how awesome I am. Whereas How Can I Stop is much more overtly vulnerable. It's the opposite. It's like, you're messing with me.
Right.
Not I'm going to mess with you. And I believe that How Can I Stop is actually, it's the same as All About You. Everybody thought All About You was about Anita, but it's actually about Mick, I think.
Or some amalgam of those two relationships.
Some synthesis of the two.
Yeah.
The same thing is true of How Can I Stop. It's equally as about Paddy as it is about his relationship with Mick.
Mm-hmm.
And Don Watts will tell you the reason why the cymbal decay and everything is so important is because Don Watts actually believed that was going to be the last thing they ever recorded. Because he had been through the fight on Voodoo Lounge, and he also thought after that fight that there wouldn't be a Voodoo Lounge, that it would never come out, and that would be the end of the Stones. He didn't believe that they would ever make another record after Bridges to Babylon because of the turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we are in 2017, where they've just announced that they are doing another record, and they've already done. After Babylon, they did 4 new licks. Yeah,
they did a couple more songs later for Gurr, and they did a covers record just last year.
And ABB, like a Bigger Bang, like, you can't stop the Stones. The Stones stop you.
But like I said, we're so much further ahead in time now than 20 years on. We finally have perspective on this record for what it actually was in the canon, which is actually, Don Watts in a certain sense was correct. I don't think they are going to make a record like this ever again. Like, this is the most ambitious they ever get.
And no, and the same thing applies to the tour and almost everything surrounding. If you actually, so I mentioned the No Security tour. The No Security tour was the Bridges to Babylon tour rebranded because Mick found out that they were going to get hit with a huge amount of taxes. So they said, okay, fold it up. We're going to wait till the start of the next tax season to start this new thing. But if you combine those two together, that's probably the longest running tour in rock history.
Right. It's from 97 through 99
to summer of 99.
Yeah.
And Mick Jagger jokes about this, that like he would see some artist, I think it was Lenny Kravitz. So like you run into Lenny Kravitz early on in the tour and then see him later at a party and be like, oh, you know that tour that you saw me on? I'm still doing it.
Yeah.
And so the only thing that even comes close is the current 50 and counting, zip code 14 on fire tour.
Ole, ole, ole.
That they've been on.
And now no filter.
Since 2012.
Yeah.
You know, and
it's 5 years in running.
It's less dates, though.
Yeah.
It's significantly less dates.
It's not so much a tour as a series of engagements.
All told, the Babylon tour was something like 200 dates.
Which is insane. Thinking about it now.
Utterly insane. And they had 3 copies of the stage. I think we went over that earlier.
Yeah, but even the no security shows, which were comparatively smaller production-wise, it only prefigured what they would do later with the Licks tour and the Bigger Bang tour, which was not only travel 3 different stages, but 3 different size of productions. In every town, they would maybe play 3 different size venues on the Licks tour.
Yeah, and we should talk more about this because the Bridges to Babylon tour is also very historically important because it's the first kind of online poll.
Sure.
They did it for every one of the dates. I remember going onto their website and voting on them.
Yeah, and they would show this on the screen on stage at the show. If you look at the special from St. Louis, they show the website, scrolling down through the vote tally until you get to the top. Whereas today, they just be like, "Oh yeah, you can vote, but we're going to pick the one we want to play anyhow."
Well, I still think that it's a little contrived because obviously they had Josh Redman for the
Waiting on a Friend.
Yeah, and it's too bad that No Security is out of print because that version of Waiting on a Friend with Josh Redman is worth the price of admission alone.
I agree.
It's fantastic. It's almost, I mean, I love Sonny Rollins and the original. Like, I'm not going to trash the original for a second. It's the first song I ever learned how to play. Like, I love it. I love it so much. But the Josh Redman live version is like, it's the same as Lisa doing Gimme Shelter. You think you've heard like the pinnacle of this and that there's only this one way to do it. And then you see like Lisa Fischer has reinvented the part in Gimme Shelter several times over.
Yeah.
And I think of her more than I think of Mary Clayton. And that's not disrespect. It's the difference between like a one performance that's captured in the moment versus having to
inhabit
something. Yeah. Having to live with that on the road for 20 years. Astounding.
Yeah.
Just she has such control. I'm not really a singer, right? And there are a lot of people like this, you know, obviously there's Mick and there's Tom Waits and there's people who they're not trying to dazzle you with technique. They're storytellers. Even somebody like Bowie, I would say, is that. Like Bowie is not, I don't care about his technique. What I care about is his sincerity.
This goes double for Keith too, which is why these 2 songs are so perfect. It's, the way he puts across the lyric rather than like his melodic range or his intonation that you're listening to.
It's much more like acting. Yeah. Whereas what Lisa does, like Lisa Fischer is a singer with a capital S. Like the only thing, if you haven't seen the 20 Foot from What's It, then do check it out, 20 Feet from Stardom. Because also she seems like a very centered and decent human being. And my evidence for that is that she didn't want to be famous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, she tried, like many of us had, but I think that she realized the whole thing in making her second record was, I don't really want to do this. And there's no shame in having been a part of an organization like the Rolling Stones for 30 years.
Yeah. And now being at the point where she's at now, where she has enough credibility and people respect her enough from seeing that documentary that she's able to actually go on the road as a solo artist once more, having spent that long, basically either doing studio work or working with the Stones only.
Because my feeling is that Lisa Fischer, in some alternate reality, could have been Mariah Carey.
Right.
And look what happened to her. And I'm not trying to be flippant or mean. I'm just saying it's hard. It's unbelievably hard to maintain. Like Mariah Carey did something that no other artist in the history of time has done, and having a #1 single in every year of a decade. Those records that she did are the 90s.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that. But clearly the stresses, that's not that's not really a good life. Bieber just quit touring. Like it's very, very difficult to maintain that. I think that if the Stones hadn't actually come into it as young men, like if they hadn't been doing this since they were 19, I don't know how they would do it. They just don't know anything else.
Yeah.
Which is, comes back to how can I stop?
Yeah. Once you start, how can you stop?
That's another thing, too, is that I actually started to think that there are deliberate self-references right? How Can I Stop and Start Me Up are actually kind of saying the same thing. It's just that one is more, sexual.
Yeah.
And one is more emotional. And so it's the same thing. Like Soul Survivor has the same chords as Brown Sugar. I don't think that that's an accident. I actually think because at the end of the day, they would have had to know. They wrote those songs. They would have known, and they would have had to have decided. Well, maybe they didn't talk about it, but they would have had to decided to leave it. In the same way that Jumping Jack Flash and Satisfaction are very similar. And so obviously, like, they're inhabiting the same space, and there's a reason. And I start to believe that it's actually because those are deliberate touchstones to tell you we are in the same psychological space.
Yeah. So musically, there's a thread here which leads you back to the beginning of this phase of their career, starting with Ron joining the band. So with the dawn of that era of the Stones, you have all these records that people have criticized for being too samey or too much like, self-parody. But in fact, there's been kind of reaching for a different way of approaching that stuff every time they go out and record.
I find that criticism to be really weird because the mixes on Some Girls are probably the least dense out of their entire career. There's no percussion overdubs, or I mean, there's a little bit, right? There's a tiny bit of like hand clap and shaker and tambo here and there, but there's none of the Rocky Dijon. And I always find it very, very funny that people always point to like Beggar's Banquet to Exile on Main Street as these like stripped down, pared to the bone. Okay, like some of like Parachute Woman is, but not Sympathy for the Devil. Yeah. Even something like Jumping Jack Flash has layers and layers and layers of overdubs, and that's why it sounds so good. That there are tight ones. Prodigal Son is 2 guitars, a singer, and
drum kit. That practice drum kit,
and that's it. And that's probably one of the smallest mixes aside from like Country Honk, maybe. I don't know.
Even Country Honk, like the car and all that stuff is a production overdub. It's not. It's made to trick you into thinking it's live. But it's
live,
not.
yeah, but it's not. So again, Some Girls was recorded more live than anything from the late 60s. Most of what you're hearing was tracked all at once. They weren't even wearing headphones.
Yeah, like it was off monitors
Mick
on the ground.
Was singing through a PA.
Yeah.
I don't know how you can criticize Some Girls as being this kind of bloated, overproduced thing. It's just not. You could say that about Undercover. I still think Undercover is a great record with a few missteps.
But we can save all the nitty-gritty for later episodes when we go back to do all these albums. But I think that the main thing that ties them to Bridges to Babylon and why it's such an important pivot point for the band's career is that the production techniques really did mature to the point where they literally had an unlimited canvas at this point.
Yeah, so...
And this is what they did with it.
The reason why Undercover is relevant here is because I do feel that there's a pretty pronounced difference between the way that... Now, it's the same studio. It's Pathé Marconi. It's the same as...
Some Girls and
Emotional Rescue. Yeah. So some of Emotional Rescue is Electric Lady, but
And from NASA, the Compass Point in the Bahamas, I think, too.
Yes. The thing about Undercover is that Undercover is the first one that they did in anything resembling a modern production workflow. And so, yeah, there's a few... They started to add a lot of these sequenced elements in the drum machines and stuff like that. And, like, when there's something like Too Much Blood, which is, like, fully... it's supposed to be Thriller. I didn't realize that for a long time, but Too Much Blood is a response to Thriller. And that works for me entirely because it's one consistent thing. Whereas something like those fake rototoms in
the Simmons drums.
Tie You Up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like I hate it and I want it to go away, but you can clearly hear what's the band and what was
the overdub
added later. The reason, and I said this at the beginning, I'm going to say it again, the reason why Bridges to Babylon works so much better from a production standpoint is because of that room, the Focusrite console, and the advances in the digital technology to get it to the point where everything could be blended to sound together. It's almost impossible sonically to tell what's an overdub and what's not. I mean, you can reason it out that the vocals were probably overdubbed. Very few of the vocals, I bet, were live. And, you can hear, because certain things have like ghost notes
Leakage from another take or
you can
another
hear
instrument.
some bleed here and there. You can hear Woody cackle in How Can I Stop? That I'm sure was left there on purpose.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very difficult to tell what's what on that, because it has this cohesive, it's like the low end is there, but it's still kind of like pillowy and soft. The drums are crisp and have a lot of crack to them, but they're not woody. These are all, industry approved terms for describing sound. But there's a great balance between the air and the presence.
Yeah.
And like Voodoo Lounge is also great, but it's a little more woody.
Mm-hmm.
That's a Neve console. That's Windmill Lane, where U2 does their records. Very, very good sounding record, of course. But it's a little darker, a little woodier. And I don't mean it has more raw wood. I mean it has a kind of boxiness.
Yeah.
It's still good. Some people do mixes that are really thumpy and lumpy, and some people do ones that are really crisp and lush. And Bridges of Babylon is very much the second.
And I think that this song, even though it is kind of elliptical and slow and kind of impenetrable to the average listener, it draws you in. And, by the time you get to that Wayne Shorter sax solo at the end, you're in a whole new realm.
That's the other one too, is that this is overtly, I feel that All About You is, again, I'm going to keep comparing them because Keith has got the last word on every Rolling Stones record since Emotional Rescue. Or no.
Exception of Undercover, and
yeah,
that's about pretty much 100% of the time he gets the last song on the record.
Yeah, he's definitely getting the last word here. And so he really likes Hoagie Carmichael. In fact, when Hoagie Carmichael had heard that he did a version of the Nearness of You, 80-year-old Hoagie Carmichael calls Keith up and says, "I got some other songs you might like." Just always trying to hawk product there.
That's probably why George Harrison recorded so many of his things in the 80s. Somebody in the Atlantic Records office got in touch with Hoagie Carmichael and was like, "Hey, this Beatle guy is going to record a bunch of your songs." And he's like, "Great, here's 10 more."
Yeah, no. And so How Can I Stop is definitely, I think, Keith's most successful attempt at this style. You've got Charlie Watts there in full jazz form.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Wayne Shorter.
Yeah.
Who plays? Does Daryl play bass on that?
No, it's Jeff Sarley again. I think doing the stand-up.
Again, that's what I thought. Chuck Leavell has a lot of jazz in him.
But I think Blondie's the one playing the piano on this take, or that's what he's credited
Actually,
for.
that makes sense, Blondie there. So this is, there is this made-up tension between jazz and rock.
Mm-hmm.
Jazz guys think rock guys are cavemen. Rock guys think jazz guys are ivory tower intellectuals who have no idea what the real world is. I'm going to solve this for both of you. Rock and jazz are the same thing. They are absolutely 100% the same thing. There's the influence of jazz is just so big that it's almost impossible to look back and see where this came from.
Right.
But all rhythm sections in popular music are jazz rhythm sections. All of them. There is no getting to rock and roll without the concept of
swing bands, basically.
And improvisationally based music.
Yeah.
It was a necessary step. There's no reason to fight. There's plenty of rock musicians who are very well versed in jazz and really understand it. What Keith is into is the more Sarah Vaughan, Dinah Washington, Billie Holiday,
torch ballad kind of side.
Yeah, he's not in, and there is a hard bop element to Keith Richards for sure. And Mingus, he did that Mingus, "Oh Lord, don't let them drop that atomic bomb on me" thing, which only you can watch this documentary on YouTube from Japan because Japan clearly ate it up. But yeah, it's very difficult for me to understand why people choose to fight about that. Listen to Chuck Berry.
Yeah,
Chuck Berry wanted to be Nat King Cole. Yeah, there's definitely some muddy, and there's like the more guttural blues stuff in there, but the rhythm section is pure jazz. So what Keith is doing here is saying, hey, look at the beginnings of this. Look at where this came from. And I think that How Can I Stop is definitely the one that works the most for me. The reason why I don't really like Losing My Touch a great deal is because I think he's repeating himself. It's one of the only times that I really feel he's repeating himself. But what I think is going on there is that he felt that How Can I Stop was so successful that they would try to do something like that again. If you're a rock guy, don't fight with jazz people. all those guys who played on the rock sessions in the 50s went and did jazz gigs at night.
Yeah.
Or would turn around and do session stuff. Like Earl Palmer. Earl Palmer is like New Orleans. I can't believe it took me this long to get to New Orleans. There's no session drummer in the world that doesn't have some New Orleans about him.
Right.
Like, and New Orleans.
Where do you think rudiments, like all the military influence and the swampy kind of like R&B influence, it's all coming out of those dance bands in New Orleans on,
Yeah, how a march turns into a shuffle. Like, you just like learn your history and like go back there. Like, that's what Keith is saying is like go look at the roots of rock and roll and see how far, because it's interesting to see that there's stuff like Gunface and Anybody See My Baby on the same record as something like How Can I Stop, because it's like up to the minute and then the deep and murky past. And
there's even that weird primordial kind of tuned percussion at the end, which I don't know who's playing that or what that is.
It's a thumb piano, I think.
It almost sounds like gamelan, like Indonesian gamelan. So that makes me think that it might have been a Keltner, like he might have had a couple of those weird gongs.
Right. We should also talk a little bit more about the Charlie Watts Jim Keltner project.
We may have to save it for a whole other podcast because I've never even listened to it.
Okay, so we'll do that. Get ready.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to us ramble on about this record ad nauseum. So if you liked it, get in touch with us.
Yeah, and we're going to do more of these. We have a lot more to say about weird, obscure things about the world's most popular band that somehow people don't know about.
On that note, we'll wrap it up for Under the Radar, a Rolling Stones podcast about the deep cuts and hot cookies. I've been Tim Lindsay.
And I'm Christian Bonner, and I continue to be.
And hopefully we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot. Don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about this podcast. Until the next time, we say goodbye.